I've seen this question quite a few times, asking how to create a quote-unquote variable container. In fact, I've asked this myself multiple times. We use variables all the time for various different things, and you may know a variable to be a container already, just a container of data. Now, what if we want a container of containers? And that may sound kind of confusing, but that's what we'll be covering in this video. The reason I put quotations around the term variable container is because that's not an actual thing. If you come in here to the content browser, we right click, we create a blueprint class, we drop down this all classes option. Whenever we look for a variable, there's literally only one option that comes up, and that's object. And we don't want to create an object because we can't just access this object anywhere. So it took me a while to figure out how to do this, and I think I found one method that works the best, and that is by using a game instance. You may or may not have a game instance in your project already, but if you don't, you can come down here to the content browser, right click, create a blueprint class, and look for game instance. Just select game instance here. I'm going to name this BP_game instance. Now, before we do anything else, I'm going to come up here to settings, project settings, come over here to maps and modes, and change our game instance class to BP_game instance, the one we just created. I'm going to close this. Let's go ahead and open up our BP game instance here. And immediately you'll notice this variables tab here on the left. Of course, we can just add variables in here and get various variables from our game instance. This is one way we could do it. But I think there's an even smarter way, because sure, these variables individually may be contained in this game instance, but what if I wanted multiple variable containers? One for, say, maybe character movement, or maybe level data, or enemy positions, and things like that. We could use several different containers, and we can't use multiple game instances. So I'm going to go ahead and delete this variable here, just compile and save this, and close this blueprint. I'm going to come down here to my content browser once again, right click, and under the blueprints tab here, we want to create a structure. And I'm just going to name this struct_variable container. Now, if I open up this variable container, you can see we can create multiple variables in one place. I like to think of a structure as a proper way to isolate and contain different variables of different types. So say I wanted all my movement variables to be in one container, I would put them all in a structure titled movement. But in the interest of time, I'm just going to create a few example variables. Now that we have some variables to work with, we can see that we can set some default values down here. Also, each of them have a little drop down so we could give them a tooltip to help us understand what this variable does when we're in the editor, and a few other things down here. But we don't care about any of this right now. We just want to go ahead and close this structure, go back into our game instance, open the full blueprint, and now we want to add our variable container. But of course, there's no containers tab over here, and the structure that we just created is considered a variable in and of itself. So let's come over here to the variables tab, add a variable. We'll just name this variable container. Of course, you can name this structure and this variable over here to something more descriptive of what the container actually contains. Now I'm just going to go ahead and change this variable type to our new structure that we just created, struct variable container. And now if we compile this and save this, you can see it has our container and all of its values. And that's all we need to worry about in the game instance here. I'm going to go ahead and just close this. I'm going to save all. Now, for example's sake, I'm just going to go ahead and drag a cube in here from the place actors panel, and I'm going to turn this cube into a simple player for us. I'm just going to go ahead and turn this into a blueprint. Now, the first thing I want to do here is go to my class defaults, and over here on the right, I'm going to auto receive input for player 0 under the input tab here, just so that way we can press some keys to influence what this cube does. Let's go ahead and head over to our event graph here. I'm just going to remove all of these default events, and instead I'm going to do something when we press the Q key and when we press the E key. Now, normally what we would do to access our game instance is just get game instance, and now we need to make sure that we define which game instance to get, which will be our BP game instance that we created. And because we defined this in our project settings, this will always return a success, which means we can get information from it. And the information we want to get from this is our variable that we created in it, which is our variable container. And as you can see under variables, default, we have get variable container. So I'm just going to get that. Now, whenever we press Q, I want it to give us one of these values and print it to the screen. So to do this, I can either break this structure to get all of the variables within it, or I can just right click on this pin and split the structure pin. That way way we can get information from it. And then I'm going to print string. I'm just going to connect the execution pin up here of the success. Now we could just hook up any of these values and let it convert, but I'm going to specifically return this integer value here in the string. Let it do its conversion from integer to string there, and then it will print our integer to the screen. Now if we compile this and save, we can close this, and now if we play and we hit Q, we can see in the top left it's printing 0 a bunch of times. And the reason for that is because in our structure here, by default, this integer value is 0. So if I set this to something like 7, for example, and I save this, and then I play again, if I hit Q, it's going to always return 7. Now what I want to do is I want to be able to change these values by pressing E. So I'm just going to bring this down, give us a little space here. I'm going to copy this game instance cast once again, just to make it a little easier. Connect up the execution pins there, and then we're going to, instead of getting that variable container like we did last time, see get variable container, we're going to set variable container, and that's going to allow us to define these values. So in this case, we either need to make this structure pin, or we can right click on this input pin here and split the structure pin, and now we can edit all of these values. So I'm going to change this integer value to a random integer with a max of say 100. So now whenever we press the E key, it's going to define this integer variable in our container as a random integer between 0 and 100. So if I compile and save and I close this, whenever we hit Q, it's going to return 7 by default, but now whenever we hit E, it changes it to something else. So now it's 26. If I press it again, now it's 8. And if I keep changing this constantly, it's going to give me different values. And that's great. Now we have a perfectly working variable container. But I think this could get a little bit sloppy and confusing sometimes, so I'm going to make this even easier for us in the future if we wanted to do this multiple times. Let's go ahead and close this cube blueprint here, and I'm going to right click in our content browser, come over here to blueprints again. We're going to create a blueprint function library. You can call this whatever you want. I'm just going to call this BP_project functions. I'm going to go ahead and open this up, and it gives us a function by default here. I'm just going to go ahead and name this get variable container, and we're going to do basically the same thing we just did. We're going to get our game instance. It's going to give us a world context object input here. We don't have to worry about that. We're just going to do the same thing we did before, which was cast to our BP game instance. Because it's already defined in the project settings, it's always going to return a success. But if this game instance is ever changed in the project settings, you will have to change this cast to whatever the new game instance is. That's why I think doing this in a function library is easier, because then you only ever have to change it in one place, instead of having the potential of having to change a bunch of these values all over the place throughout different blueprints. Now off of this game instance here, we're going to once again get the variable container, the variable here, and then we're going to create a return node. As you can see at the bottom here, add return node. It's going to give us this. We're just going to hook up the execution pin here. Now I'm just going to drag off of this variable container output here and just drop it on the return node. You can see it gives me a little check mark and it says add pin to node. If I just let go, it adds the output pin for us, so we don't have to set anything up over here. And now I'm going to go ahead and compile and save, close this, and go back into our cube, because now we have a new function available to us. We can just look for get variable container, and under class blueprint project functions, we have get variable container. Right now, if I get this, you can see it gives us 2 execution pins, and that's fine, but I think it might be better without. So if I just double click this, it'll open up this function's location. We can just click on this function here. We can click it over here in the functions tab or on the return node, wherever, it doesn't matter. We just need to change one thing under the details graph section where it says pure. We want this to be a pure function. If I compile this, save this, go back to my cube blueprint here, you can see now it's just like our game instance. So now we can just go ahead and get rid of this. In fact, we can even get rid of this right here. And now all we need to do is split this structure and get our integer value. And now we have everything that we were just doing before, but very condensed. Now it's very easy to get our values from our variable container, but now we need to do the same thing for setting them. So let's go ahead and open up our project functions library here again. And we're just going to come over here and add a function on the left. We're going to name this one set variable container values. We're going to do pretty much the same thing again, just get the game instance. Don't worry about the world context object. We're going to cast to our BP game instance. Hook up the execution pin here. Off of the game instance information here, we're going to set variable container. And under the variables here, we're going to set variable container. Hook up the execution pin to the success there. We'll add a return node, hook up the execution pin. But instead of trying to connect our output pin to the return node here, this time we're going to return this input pin over at the input node here. So if I just drag this variable container input pin all the way over to our input node here, we can just drop this and then add a pin, and it will automatically add that. I'm just going to click this and rename it over here under inputs in the details panel to new values. And then, because why not, I'm just going to drag off of this output node here, drop it on the return node, and this is going to be our variable container. Do a little bit of rerouting here to make it look a little bit neater. Now we can compile, save, and close this library here. Let's go ahead and open our cube again. We're going to get rid of everything except for the random integer because that's the only thing we need now. And we're going to now use the node that we just created that was set variable container values. And this one we do want to be a regular function, not a pure function, because we want to be able to hook this up through the execution pin. Now I'm going to right click on the new values pin and split this structure pin, hook up this random integer back to our integer value here. There we go. Now if I compile and save, this will do exactly what we were doing before. If I play, we hit Q, it returns 7, but as soon as I hit E, it returns us a different value when I hit Q again. We can do this as many times as we want, and it will always return us a new value. And there we go. That is the best way that I've found to create quote-unquote variable containers in the Unreal Engine, since there is no way to create a variable container by default. I know that was all covered pretty quickly, but I hope that gives you a general understanding of how you can use variable containers to your advantage in your projects. It took me a while to understand how variables could potentially communicate across blueprints, but hopefully this clears things up for you and gives you a few different ways that you can now use variables in your projects in the future. Thank you for watching this video. I hope it helped you in some way. If it did, make sure to share this with a friend, give the video a like, and even subscribe if you haven't already. Thank you guys for the incredible support you've given me and my channel over the past few months, and as always, I hope to see you in the next one.